Okay, so last time we ended, I just put up this figure here, which is sort of a stylized figure, but I guess the point across that if you have a very, very risky procedure like this carotid endarterectomy, then there's a limit to how much you can really do as long as you have any concern about the welfare of your patients at all, because unless they're really in need of it, you don't want to go and put them through the risk of going through that procedure. On the other hand, if you have a low-risk procedure like angioplasty, where all you're doing is going in with sort of through a very small incision and going with a catheter and inserting a stent and blowing up a little balloon, you could potentially, if you're not thinking about cost and you're only thinking about is the person perhaps going to be better off having gotten this procedure than they would be if they didn't get it, you could sort of potentially make that argument for a very large group of people, which means that you could feel sort of justified in giving it to many people. So, the thing is, the point here is really that there's what we call heterogeneity in the benefits of these procedures. So we're not saying, the point is not that we shouldn't have invented stents and angioplasty, or that we should never give them. We definitely should in some cases, but those cases are relatively rare. These are basically cases where people have just had heart attacks. And so if you want to sort of think about, if you want to think about the cost curves and benefit curves that we had discussed earlier here, what a curve probably looks like is something like this red line here in terms of the benefits. So remember, S of x is basically a measure of the benefits. S prime of x is the marginal benefit of each additional procedure that you do. And so for those first procedures, there's a pretty high benefit, but it's decreasing because there's not that many people who are having heart attacks at any given time where you're going to come in and intervene right after they have the heart attack and give them angioplasty, or PCI is what it's abbreviated as. So the benefits, the marginal benefit falls off. Then the cost per PCI is, we're assuming to be constant. I guess it might actually not be constant because you could think that, as you give more and more of them, maybe resources become more constrained and maybe the costs could actually be increasing, but that's not so important from our perspective. You can basically sort of treat it as being roughly constant. So from a social planner's perspective, what you'd like to do is, give the treatment up until the point at which those two curves cross, which is the point at which the marginal benefits and the marginal costs are being equated. But, from the perspective of a doctor who's making decisions just based on their clinical judgment, not based on sort of what the potential costs of these procedures are, you'd want to keep on giving it as long as you think that S prime of x is positive. So what you would end up doing potentially is, give the procedure all the way out until you get to the point where this red line is crossing the x-axis. So you can see in this sort of stylized figure, that point happens to be well over twice as many, well over double the number of patients as the social planner would ideally give it to. And the thing that's really driving it here is that, so initially you have this steep decrease in marginal benefits, but eventually that sort of evens out. So the idea here is, for this group is consists of people for whom there's a pretty big benefit to the procedure, but there aren't that many people so that would benefit a lot from the procedure. So after you run through that group, the marginal benefit per person falls off pretty quickly. But then once you sort of get out into this range, you're sort of in the range where there's very little benefit to the person, but then there's also very little cost other than the actual resource cost. There's very little cost in terms of risk because it is a low risk procedure. So you sort of have this very large group of people for whom there's a relatively small benefit, but there's also relatively low risk, and that's what flattens out the curve. And the problem with flattening out that curve there is that it can then take it a long time to cross the x-axis and get to the point at which the doctors would not recommend that you do it. So the total cost, of course, is going to be just the area under the cost curve there, which is this rectangle that goes from 0 out to x prime, which is the point at which the marginal benefit curve crosses the x-axis. If you wanted to think about the total net benefits of the procedures, of giving all of these procedures, right, what you'd have to do is calculate the cost, which are the blue shaded area, and then you'd have to calculate the area under the S prime of x curve from the origin out to x prime, right? And it's not, I guess looking at it, it looks like the way we drew it, there's probably negative net benefits in the sense that the area that, so we know that this area between the blue line on top here and then the red curve out to x prime. So this is all sort of a wash because it's under the cost curve and it's under the benefits curve. So for the total net benefits in this area would be 0. So then you just have to compare the additional benefits that are between the blue line and the red line here with the additional costs which are above the red line but below the blue line. And so I guess to my eyes it looks like the the shaded blue area that's above the red line is probably larger than the white area that's below the red line. But this again is just a stylized example. But in this particular case, you would have sort of, even though there are potentially a lot of net benefits to giving the procedure up until the point at which you don't want to give it anymore, which is where the two lines cross, you've sort of overprescribed it so much at this point that the net benefits would actually be negative here, just because you're spending so much giving the procedure to people who don't actually benefit from it, or at least don't benefit very much from it. Now, the thing that's interesting here is that, again, the way that we drew these curves, which I think is not unrealistic, the way that the curves are drawn actually implies that if there are relatively small differences in the beliefs of the doctors who are prescribing the procedure, that can actually have really large cost implications, right? So what we're doing here is we're taking the initial, so costs we're keeping fixed. We assume the hospital knows what the costs are, although as I mentioned before, it's often hard to actually assign costs to specific procedures. But we're going to assume that the costs are pretty well known, and the only thing that's not certain is exactly what the benefits of giving angioplasty are, right? So initially, maybe one set of doctors thought that the benefits were represented by this red curve, but then you sort of come to another set of doctors, and for whatever reason, maybe they read some different articles or their own experiences with angioplasty if it's slightly more positive or something like that. But for whatever reason, they think that it's slightly more effective than the first group of doctors did. So the additional effectiveness we're representing by basically just shifting the red curve up to that blue dash curve by a very small amount, right? So we're saying for any given patient, we're going to assume that the net benefit is not at the red line, but it's at the red line plus epsilon or plus some small number. So you can see that sort of in the range, like if you're thinking about stopping at the point where the two curves cross, so if you're thinking about stopping at the social optimum, things don't change very much when you go from the red curve to the blue dash curve, right? Which is perhaps not surprising, or I don't know, maybe somewhat reassuring in the sense that we would hope that if we're sort of at the optimum, if we sort of solved, for what the optimal number of procedures is, that if we have sort of very small perturbations in our beliefs about the effectiveness of the procedure, that shouldn't result in sort of massive differences in terms of how many procedures we're doing and what the net benefits are going to be, right? And you can see that that's true. You just move from like this point to this point, which are very close to each other. The problem is though, that's not where we're really stopping, right? So we're stopping when the curve crosses the x-axis, and so you're going to move from the point x, which is where the red curve crosses the x-axis, to the point that's labeled z, which is where the blue dashed curve crosses the x-axis. And you can see that like dramatically increases the total cost because you have that additional square that's being additional like blue shaded square that's being added on. I don't know, I guess technically it's rectangle, but it's 3 squares that's being added on between x and z. And so what's going on there is that essentially because the slope of the line, so the slope of the curve, is so shallow when you get out further along the x-axis, if you just shift the curve up by a little bit, that actually moves you pretty far along the x-axis, right? So you had a large group of patients who you thought had almost no benefit from it, and there was some like small amount of risk involved in the procedure. Initially, you might not have been treating those patients when you thought that the treatment had the effectiveness that was represented by the red curve. But then when you sort of come in with a different group of physicians who think that the treatment is just a little bit more effective, you end up making it worthwhile from their perspective to treat that very large group of patients who are right on the margin. And so that's going to dramatically increase the costs. But of course, the actual benefits of the procedure are not going to, or the net benefits that you're getting from even just the gross benefits you're getting from changing from X to Z are very, very small because those are all people who are right on the margin in terms of whether or not they receive any benefit at all from getting the procedure. So that's how you can get pretty large increases in costs from just minor changes in doctors' beliefs about the effectiveness of a given procedure. So supporting sort of this, this model of which treatments or which types of treatments are going to be most sort of responsive to physician beliefs or are going to be most, amenable to overprescription. You can see here, okay, so what's being plotted here is basically the ratio of, or not the ratio, but really just the amount of spending on a bunch of different categories, a bunch of different types of services across different quintiles. So Q1 quintile 1 here is the lowest quintile, so this is like an area that has the lowest spending. Q2 is the next lowest. Q3 is sort of at the median. Q4 is pretty high, and then Q5 is spending on these various types of services for the area that has the highest amount of spending. This is actually end-of-life expenditures. And so So they've broken it down into 5 different types of services. So the first one, the light blue one, is valuation and management. The green one is diagnostic tests. Then the red one is imaging, which is I guess somewhat related to diagnostic tests. But the yellow one is minor procedures, and then the dark blue one is major procedures. And so on the right-hand side, what they did is they just calculated the ratio of the largest quintile, the highest quintile, to the lowest quintile for each of these different categories of services. And so that sort of gives you a sense of which categories of services are driving increased spending in the high expenditure areas relative to the low expenditure areas. And so you can see that the top 3, evaluation and management, diagnostic tests, and imaging, those have those have the highest ratio, so they're all sort of like a 1.7 to 1.8 range. And that's consistent with the model that we had just talked about in the sense that those are all extremely low-risk procedures, right? So like diagnostic tests in general involve no risk at all. Imaging can technically involve some very minor risk, but it wouldn't be obvious to the patient, to the patient or the physician, just in the sense that if the imaging you're doing is like a CAT scan or something like that, which is a type of X-ray, it actually involves like a non-trivial amount of exposure to ionizing radiation. So you don't want to basically, if you have something that requires that type of imaging, certainly you want to do it, but you don't want to get a CAT scan just for the sake of getting a CAT scan. So that's sort of like that's like the highest amounts of risk that you would generally be thinking about in these types of categories. And that's still very low. What we're talking about is like, well, if you give thousands and thousands of CAT scans to people, to lots and lots of people, then maybe you might induce like 1 additional case of cancer or something like that. So we're still talking about very low risks here. So we can see that basically the sort of the low risk types of services are much higher in the high spending areas than the low spending areas. And then when you go to minor procedures, it's like, well, it's about a 1.5 to 1 ratio. So certainly they are doing more procedures, or at least spending more on procedures in the high spending areas than the low spending areas. But it's not quite as pronounced as it is with like say diagnostic or imaging. And again, that's kind of consistent. So when you're talking about minor procedures, these are things that are probably relatively low risk, but they're not going to be zero risk. They might involve actually cutting into people one way or another. And then when you get to major procedures, which are presumably going to be the highest risk type of procedures because that might involve you actually having to stay in the hospital and so forth, those actually there's almost no relationship there between there's no increase or gradient there between the high spending areas and low spending areas. The ratio is only 1.05. So this is consistent at least with the type of model that we just discussed. Now, things also become so when you're talking about basically like things about doing procedures where there are very high fixed costs and relatively low marginal costs, you sort of really get into cases where the incentives to try to give as many of these procedures as possible become quite substantial. So this is actually basically an advertisement for urologists to pushing them to try to capitalize literally on imaging opportunities in urology. And so what they're doing is, so I think this is like basically a CAT scan. This is like sort of marketing material from a company that is going to sell CAT scan machines to urologists. And what they're doing is charting out sort of how much money you can potentially make depending on how many procedures you do per day. So there's sort of 3 scenarios that they're presenting here for you. In the first scenario, you're only doing about 2 procedures per day, operating it for 20 days per month. The amount that you're receiving per procedure is $220, and so you end up making like $8,000, I assume, per month. Then apparently, if you do that and think about the return on investment over 5 years, it turns out you're going to break even in terms of just making back the money that it cost you to purchase the machine. So that's not that type of utilization would not make for a very compelling case to purchase their product. So clearly that's not what you want to be doing. So you need to boost your utilization up to maybe 5 procedures per day. At that point, the return on investment over 5 years works out to $843,000 according to the company's calculations, which is pretty good. But even better would be to just have that thing running all the time. So you do like 10 procedures per day, and then your return on investment over 5 years jumps up to $2.1 or $2.2 million. So the push there is once you have that machine installed, of course you want to use it as much as possible and do as much diagnostic imaging as possible. And again, with these things that are relatively low risk, it's not like there's going to be some the physician has no sort of like ethical obligation to not give you a low risk procedure if they think that it might help you, and there's no risk and you don't really have to pay for it anyway because it's covered by your insurance. Then why not do it? So in terms of then thinking about how these different categories of treatments that we talked about map into costs and health, basically what we can have here, so this is looking at categories of treatments related to heart disease, which was the example we were talking about. You sort of have these 3 categories, and in that first category, things like aspirin and beta blockers, these things are all very, very cheap, but have tremendous impact on health. So you get a huge return on investment there from the perspective of like a social planner. You then move to the kind of the mid-range category, things that are somewhat more expensive and maybe don't improve health quite as much, but still the net benefits are positive. And then you're moving into things like angioplasty and even more expensive things like doing bypass surgery and so forth. And there, ironically, despite the extreme expense, there often is not a huge impact on health. Although again, as we said, there's potentially a lot of heterogeneity. So like with angioplasty, it will be certainly beneficial for some people, but maybe not for the majority of people for whom it's currently being given, at least in the United States. So if you wanted to think about or to try to account for the improved cardiovascular health from 1980 to 2000, so this is somewhat similar to some of the calculations that we've seen before, except now it's just focusing on cardiovascular health, not looking at sort of overall population health. This is not again. This is we don't have like great estimates of the causal effects of some of these factors on cardiovascular health, just because these aren't all things that we're able to run sort of clinical trials on, or randomly assign, or even come up with kind of like studies with natural experiments to try to estimate the effects. But with that sort of caveat, the article that's being summarized here is essentially trying to do sort of an accounting of all the different potential factors that affect cardiovascular health that have changed from 1980 to 2000. And so there's been a mortality decline in cardiovascular or from cardiovascular health. So there has been substantial improvement over the past few decades. I mean, it used to be the case that basically like so basically cardiovascular disease killed many more people per year than cancer, and it still is the leading killer, but that those two factors have grown much closer than they used to be, or the gap between them has shrunk considerably. And a lot of that is because of improved cardiovascular health. So the good news is like deaths from cardiovascular disease have dropped considerably. The sort of bad news is that deaths from cancer haven't dropped as much. Part of that is because we haven't come up with as effective treatments for cancer as we have for cardiovascular health. The other part of it is essentially that as you sort of improve cardiovascular health and people live longer and longer, they're more likely to eventually get cancer at some point. So it's not some of it. There are competing risks at the end of the day. Like if we cured all disease, then eventually everybody would just die of car accidents. So what you can see here is that basically if we think about things that aren't really like clinical treatments, so things like lifestyle changes. So there's been a decline in smoking, improved management of hypertension, so that's high blood pressure, improved management of cholesterol levels, and potentially reductions in physical inactivity. Those factors are you basically can explain about 60% of the decline in cardiovascular mortality, according to the author's calculation. So the majority of it is coming from sort of managing these risk factors rather than actually like treating people who have been diagnosed with heart disease or who have had heart attack. So that's where the majority of it is coming from. Although it's being offset, right? So the things you also have like an increase in the population in body mass index, so obesity, which we talked about earlier in the course, and then also like diabetes rates have been increasing. So there's some improvement on those first set of factors, but then there's actually a decline from a health perspective for the second set of factors. And so when you sort of take the net of those two, you end up with maybe a 44% or explaining like 44% of the total drop in deaths. So that's from sort of health risk factors. And then when you look at these other categories of treatments that we talked about, so just the fact that now people are so like aspirin is not something that we developed during that period. It's been around for like over a century, but now we know to prescribe it for people who have heart disease. And then we have things like beta blockers and stuff, which were developed somewhat later, but at this point are not wouldn't be considered anything particularly new. So those cheap treatments are alone basically the increased use of them or the development of them explains another 22% of the improvement. Then you have sort of the intermediate cost treatments are explaining like 13%, and then all of the things that are very expensive like angioplasty and coronary bypass surgery and so forth are only explaining about 12% or only accounting for about 12% of the decrease in mortality. So again, this is, you can see that the cost is not related to like number of deaths averted. If anything, the low cost treatments are responsible for more of the decline than the high cost treatments. And then there's just some residual. So if you sum the 44 plus 47, you'll come out to 90 or 91%. So like 10% they aren't able to explain. That's just kind of a residual factor. Everything adds up to 100% or 101 rounding perhaps. So then to sort of summarize, come back to the original question. So the U.S. is different than other countries, or if you want to think of it within the U.S., like or Los Angeles or Miami are different from Minneapolis. There's sort of a lot more of this category 3 spending, so a lot more spending on the very expensive procedures that potentially have sort of a lot of elasticity because they don't have a ton of risks. So we shouldn't be doing more of the super high risk procedures because that would basically be unethical. But things like angioplasty and stuff where you can make a good case that the patient at least won't be harmed by it. We can do a lot more of that. So there's a lot more of that spending. There's not necessarily more of this category 1 spending. So there's sort of very cheap, very effective treatments. We presumably both countries spend on that. If anything, the U.S. might sort of lag a little bit just because we don't have universal or near universal coverage yet. So you might, there might be sort of very cheap treatments we could give you if you went to the doctor, but you don't need to go to the doctor because you're deterred by costs. So the fact that there is more of this category 3 spending expensive stuff would imply faster growth relative to GDP than other countries, which of course we've observed. There is potential, there's big potential for cost-saving institutional reform, which could sort of swamp the importance of any cost-saving technologies. So one hope would be that we invent procedures or invent technologies that are cheaper than what we're currently using, but are similarly effective. That might happen in some cases, but I think there's no reason to believe that it would happen on a very broad basis. On the other hand, trying to actually limit the use of procedures that maybe don't have a lot of risk, but also don't have a lot of benefit, could have pretty substantial impacts on costs. The problem is that politically speaking, anytime you bring up the issue of cost, things quickly head south. So basically, what you have then are people talking about quote-unquote death panels, because now you're saying, well, my grandmother has stable angina and her doctor said she should get an angioplasty, and so we really need to give this person angioplasty, even though there's probably no benefit to them. But there might be. You never know. You can't prove that there isn't.